people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Savannah Marshall versus Femke Hermans. Let's talk about the fight. Well, I'll say that Femke was a little trickier in the beginning than I expected. A little quicker, frantically staying out of the way, or trying to stay out of the way, of Savannah Marshall's onslaught, Savannah Marshall's punches. A fight that lasted all of 3 rounds. The first round was a feel-out round, but by the 3rd round, you guys saw what happened. I want to say that Savannah Marshall carries power in both hands. I want to say that because she's an ambidextrous fighter that can fight out of the orthodox or southpaw stances, that makes her 2 times as tricky and 2 times as dangerous as someone else. We saw in this fight Savannah seamlessly switching from orthodox to southpaw, back to orthodox, back to southpaw.
As Femke scurried away.
Before that highlight reel knockout, you saw that Femke, she made Savannah miss a couple of shots, but what shots got through, here and there, they buzzed her.
They hurt her.
Femke Hermans, who tried her best to not be frazzled by the size, punching power of Savannah Marshall, attempting to counter.
In moments where Savannah was applying pressure.
Savannah's physical dimensions, her height, her reach, her length, made it possible for her to launch her onslaught while simultaneously staying out of harm's way on the outside, coupled with her movement, angling off, staying off the line, rolling punches off the shoulder, getting under and or around punches. Tough night at the office for Femke Hermans in a fight that worked out exactly as I predicted, exactly as I expected. I expected that Savannah Marshall would be the first one to stop Femke Hermans. Femke, who's never been stopped.
I'm telling you guys for years, her power is no product of matchmaking.
Power is real. Whether we're talking about Maria Lindbergh, who had never been stopped, Lolita Muzea, Hannah Rankin, or Femke Hermans, all the same.
All fighters who had never been stopped.
That changed when they fought Savannah. That changed when they fought Savannah because I've been telling you for years. The power is real.
It's not the matchmaking. The power is real.
Savannah Marshall yesterday advanced to a professional record of 12 wins, no losses, no draws, with 10 knockouts.
Silent assassin.
Quiet confidence that she carried in what was her 3rd successful defense of the WBO middleweight title, ahead of what is to be that long-awaited, long-anticipated Claressa Shields showdown.
Claressa Shields was ringside for the fight.
Claressa Shields, who's often downplayed Savannah Marshall's punching power in her highlight reel knockouts, attempting to explain them away behind matchmaking and timing, that these are short-notice opponents that Savannah's taking up. But Hannah Rankin was no short-notice opponent. Claressa herself stated that Lolita Muzea, she was a welterweight that moved up in weight. And while that is true,
Hannah Gabriels was a junior middleweight that Claressa fought at middleweight.
A junior middleweight that had actually been stopped at junior middleweight in the past, ahead of her fight with Claressa. But Claressa, naturally bigger girl, she couldn't stop her. In fact, in that fight, Claressa's the one that hit the deck. Claressa's the one that was knocked down.
Knocked down by Hannah Gabriels.
Savannah Marshall, she's never been knocked down, let alone by a fighter that was moving up in weight, the way that Claressa Shields was knocked down by Hannah Gabriels, who moved up in weight. These are just the facts.
It's just reality. You don't have to like it.
Claressa stated size don't matter, height don't matter, and fake punching power, quote-unquote, don't matter. The greatest is here, and the greatest there ever will be. I'm taking on all doubters. 10 years ago, I literally made history, 17-year Olympic champion, and you'll notice how she...
Fake punching power? Who's got fake punching power?
She's referring to Savannah Marshall. That's what she's talking about. But there's nothing fake about Savannah Marshall's punching power. Not when she's faced 2 of the same girls that Claressa fought, 2 of the same girls Claressa went the distance with. But unlike Claressa, she stopped those girls. Made it look easy. No. There's nothing fake about Savannah Marshall's punching power. And I don't know if this is just Claressa trash talking to sell the fight, or trying to convince herself that Savannah's power isn't real.
Oh, it's real.
Dismissing your power because you hadn't fought nobody, and Claressa's worlds, you fought tomato cans, that's why you're knocking them out, but you've just done it to Femke, so the power is real.
She's boxed Femke, how can she say that? I'm sure Hannah Rankin's her best pal. That's a bit sly of her. No, but yeah, Femke's never been stopped, and she's been in with some good girls. Lindsay DeRoss, the super middleweight. She's a big heavy-handed girl. Alicia Napoleon, obviously Clarissa. To be honest, I thought she'd be there all night. So I've surprised myself a little bit.
When the referee called it off.
Those comments from Clarissa, they're not aging well. Ultimately, it is what it always was. It's a question of whether or not Clarissa Shields can take Savannah Marshall's power, because the power in and of itself, it's real. It's a question of whether or not Clarissa can take her power and whether or not Savannah can actually deliver it, as Clarissa Shields is a harder target, a much harder target than a Hannah Rankin or a Femke Herman. You know, I honestly don't think Clarissa can take Savannah's power if she lands. Question is, can she land? Will she? In men's welterweight news, Errol Spence Jr.'s trainer Derek James on Spence's surgically repaired eye. We haven't even thought about it. That's a little hard to believe. Yordanis Ugas' trainer Ismail Salas stated during the WBA Super Welterweight Champions Open Workout Wednesday that the Spence he watched unanimously outpoint Danny Garcia in December of 2020 wasn't the same as the Spence that dropped Porter in the 11th round and beat him by split decision 2.5 years ago at Staples Center in Los Angeles. Spence suffered various injuries, one in a car accident less than 2 weeks after he topped Porter, and nearly 2 years later underwent surgery to repair a torn left retina last August. Spence will fight for the first time April 16th since the southpaw's left eye was surgically repaired 7 months ago, though he has fought only once in the 30 months since his victory over Sean Porter in their 12-round welterweight title unification fight. Odds makers have installed Spence as almost a 4-1 favorite to defeat Yordanis Ugas in their own 147-pound championship unification match. Errol Spence Jr. being the favorite in this fight comes as a surprise to no one. What's surprising is that Derek James states they haven't even thought about the surgically repaired eye, the retina situation. I find that a little hard to believe. You would think that if the guy's coming off a surgery to a damaged eye, some focus might go into protecting that eye. Well, it's either the guy's lying and he's putting on a brave face, or he's telling the truth and they're approaching this unification match in a rather foolhardy manner. I happen to think that detached retina, torn retina, whatever it was, that was a residual byproduct of the car accident, Errol Spence Jr. being hurled out of that Ferrari, landing on his face. It's great, Spence told Premier Boxing Champions Ray Flores during Spence's open workout Thursday in Dallas. We haven't even thought about it. I mean, it's not even an issue. Dallas's James doesn't agree, either with Salas' assessment of how Spence performed while defeating Philadelphia's Danny Garcia by unanimous decision, in contrast to how he looked when he fought Porter. I think you just see a different fighting style, James said. I mean, different strategy, different game plan for a different fighter. And at the same time, that's all it is. I mean, it wasn't even about being different from the car accident. He's okay. He's good. Derek James makes a valid point that Danny Garcia and Sean Porter are two different fighters. Sean Porter is an, according to Hoyle, mid-range to inside pressure guy, whereas Danny's more of a boxer-puncher with an affinity for counter-punching. So maybe the reason that Errol looked a little different with Danny than he did with Sean is because Danny and Sean, well, they got different base styles, so you fight them differently. Maybe that's the way it is. Yeah, maybe, or maybe Derek's just putting on a brave face. It's been great, James said. Man, he's been working hard. He's been looking very strong. Had some very physical, very quick, very sharp sparring partners to keep him on his toes, and he's not coming 100%. They're gonna let him know, but he's been really well. What do you expect the guy to say? That he's worried about the eye, that he's concerned about the amount of time Errol Spence Jr. has spent away from the ring, that this isn't the ideal match for a guy who hasn't fought since December of 2020. I mean, what are we really expecting Derek James to say? Ultimately, regardless of Ismail Salas' anecdotes or Derek James's anecdotes, the way I see it, I've got my own anecdotes, and there's a lot to be concerned with here. Not just what could be residual injuries from that initial car accident that might have led to that retina injury, also the time off, and also the fighter himself, Yordanis Ugas, and who's in his corner, Ismail Salas. Yordanis Ugas, he's a decent-sized welterweight. He's not small for the weight. He's quick, sharp, and I expect him to be sharp the night of the fight, the night of the Errol Spence Jr. unification match, whereas Errol hasn't boxed in the last 12 months. Yordanis Ugas have. Against a southpaw like Errol Spence Jr. is a southpaw. Manny Pacquiao, like Errol Spence Jr., he was coming off a lengthy stint of inactivity. No injuries to report, but he was out of action a while, the same way that Errol Spence Jr. has been out of action a while. There's a lot of cause for concern here if you're an Errol Spence Jr. fan.
Never really been sold on Errol Spence Jr.'s punching power.
The last time this guy stopped somebody was in 2018 against Carlos Ocampo. He's not as big a puncher as they say, not from where I'm sitting, much less when he's been as inactive as he's been. I don't get the sense he's going to stop Yordenis Ugas. I don't. He couldn't stop Mikey Garcia, so he's going to stop a naturally bigger guy, more experienced at this weight. In Yordenis Ugas, I don't think so. Yordenis Ugas has never been stopped. He may have suffered 4 professional defeats in his professional career, but none of them were by way of knockout.
I'm not convinced Errol knocks this guy out. If he beats him on points.
If he can beat him. Yordenis Ugas' base style doesn't do Errol's base style any favors. Errol Spence Jr. characteristically is a very prolific puncher, a busy puncher, whereas Yordenis Ugas, he's more prone to countering the man opposite the ring. So when you've got a guy like Errol, who opens up as much as Errol does, that will afford Yordenis Ugas that many more opportunities to employ those counter shots.
Because Errol throws a lot of punches.
Yeah, Errol Spence Jr. the last time out, he beat a very experienced counterpuncher in Danny Gersha. I will say Yordenis Ugas is a longer, rangier guy than Danny Gersha. Quicker, too.
And not as flat-footed.
It's not actually easy to pressure Yordenis Ugas. I have to say, comparatively, Sean Porter, an according to Hoyle, mid-range to inside pressure fighter, gave Yordenis Ugas a lot more respect, I think, than he gave Errol Spence Jr.
It was because of the counterpunching.
Catching Sean Porter with shots as he attempted to come in on Yordenis Ugas, while at the same time maintaining that pocket by taking a half step back whilst doing so. I have to say, Ugas is a harder guy to pressure, looked like a harder guy to pressure to me than Errol Spence Jr. was for Sean Porter.
Yeah, Errol couldn't keep Sean out.
From where I'm sitting, there's a lot to be concerned with here. If you're an Errol Spence Jr. fan, an Errol Spence Jr. supporter, the eye injury could be residual effects of the car accident, and if that doesn't bother you, what about the time off? Over 12 months away from the ring, over 12 months out of action, ring rust. He may have to shake off the night of the fight, coupled with a guy whose base style doesn't do Errol's base style any favors. It's very inopportune. Not ideal for a guy coming off a long layoff and an eye surgery.
It's not unusual for Ismael Salas' fighters to pull the upset.
Kazuto Ioka upset Kosei Tanaka, who was the betting favorite. Joe Joyce upset Daniel Dubois, who was the betting favorite. More recently, Hector Garcia upset Chris Colbert. Hector Garcia is an Ismael Salas fighter.
There's cause for concern here.
From where I'm sitting, it really isn't a foregone conclusion that Errol Spence Jr. beats Yordenis Ugas, let alone knocks him out. It will take a convincing victory, not a political decision, to convince me that Errol Spence Jr. isn't damaged goods, because there's a
strong case that he is.
This ain't like that Danny Garcia fight. Ahead of that Danny Garcia fight, I told you guys here on this channel that Danny Garcia is a tune-up fight, no more and no less for Errol Spence Jr. That's what that fight would be, and that's how that fight would play out. I picked Errol Spence Jr. to win a points decision in that fight, but in this fight, it's different.
Ugas isn't flat-footed.
Like Danny Garcia is, prone to letting the other guy lead the dance, the way that Danny Garcia is.
The way he does, falling just short of the other guy and what the other guy's doing.
Ugas can disrupt Errol Spence Jr. in all the ways that Danny Gersha did not.
He might stop him.
A scenario that I don't think very many of you out there are willing to entertain. You Errol Spence Jr. fans, Errol Spence Jr. supporters, elated to see him return to action without highlighting why it is he's boxed.
You don't think it's at all relevant? This guy's only boxed once in the last 2 years?
For my money, Ugas is a tougher test for an inactive fighter looking to snap back from that stint of inactivity. He's a tougher test for Errol than Danny Garcia was.
I think Ugas is hungrier than Danny was, too.
I think Ugas wants it more. I think he wants to beat Errol more than Danny did, and overall, I think Ugas wants it more than Errol does.
Yordenis Ugas isn't a fighter that's had the red carpet rolled out for him.
Might actually be hungrier than Errol Spence Jr. That's not far-fetched at all.
So in the spirit of fairness and objectivity,
If Errol Spence Jr. beats Yordenis Ugas, if Errol wins and he unifies those 3 alphabet titles, he will be reintegrated into the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list.
that will be the 3rd active reigning world champion he's taken a belt from.
Took the IBF title from Kell Brook in Sheffield, took Sean Porter's WBC title, he took his green belt, and if he beats Yordenis Ugas for his black and gold belt here in 2022, he will have a very credible argument to be reintegrated into the list. He will show that he's still got it.
He'll come in the bottom tier at either number 8 or number 9.
As the number 8 ranked Juan Francisco Estrada, Mexico's own Gallo Estrada. That guy hasn't fought in a while, you do realize that. You do realize he hasn't boxed since the Chocolatito rematch way back when early last year. We haven't seen a lot of that guy since then. He was supposed to box Chocolatito for a second time, but post-COVID symptoms kept him out of action, and at this point, he's just taking up space. If Errol beats Yordenis Ugas, he may come in at either number 8 or number 9. That has yet to be determined. Style points have to be considered as well. That's if Errol Spence Jr. beats Yordenis Ugas. But if Ugas beats Spence, it's not...
No, it's not as cut and dry if Ugas beats Spence.
If Ugas beats Errol Spence Jr., that will be the first active reigning world champion he's actually won a belt from. Need I remind you, when he boxed Manny Pacquiao last year, Manny Pacquiao was not a champion. He was, 42 years old, coming off of 2 years of inactivity. By the time he fought Manny, Ugas was already elevated to WBA welterweight champion, and Manny was labeled a champion in recess.
We don't know that today's Errol Spence Jr. still is a pound-for-pound fighter.
This fight will tell us, here today, what he is and what he ain't. But if he can't beat a guy like Yordenis Ugas, if Ugas beats him...
That is yet another inactive fighter he will have beaten.
Manny Pacquiao was inactive. Errol Spence Jr. has been inactive. It'll be yet another inactive fighter Yordenis Ugas will have beaten. It'll be the first world champion he's ever won a belt from. And that in and of itself, it's not as strong an argument. Doesn't give him a stronger argument than the other fighters ranked on this list.
How do we know he doesn't beat Errol, and it's because he just happened to catch him at the right time, same as Manny?
If Yordenis Ugas pulls the upset, and he upsets the apple cart for Errol Spence Jr., would you guys out there, consider Ugas a pound-for-pound fighter, pound-for-pound in the sport, or would you consider it happenstance, a lucky turn of chance, that he just so happened to catch the worst version of Errol Spence? He caught that guy at the right time to catch that guy. I'll tell you what I think. The Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, devoid of anecdotes, devoid of annotations. Based on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list's governing criteria, even with that big upset, as big as it would be, it still doesn't give Ugas a strong enough argument to where he'd secure a cushy spot on this list. It really doesn't, because Errol would be the only active reigning world champion that guy won a belt from. Even if he's winning 2 or 3 or however many belts from that guy, it's still the only champion he will have beaten.
It's simple. If Errol beats Ugas,
that'll be the third reigning world champion he won a belt from.
The third.
But if Ugas beats Errol, that'll be the first for Ugas. The first reigning champion Ugas won a belt from, compared to all of these guys.
Yeah, those eggs need more bacon because it's not that strong an argument.
You might be telling yourself that the same applies to George Kambosos. The only champion he beat was Teofimo Lopez. But why do you think George is at the bottom? The very bottom, in the most danger of being bumped off.
Teofimo was ranked on this list at the time George beat him.
Errol Spence Jr. isn't. He's been out too long to maintain a rank on this list. He has to beat Ugas in order to be reintegrated into it.